Hi, everybody, and welcome to Amongst Other Thing, the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my co-host today is
Dennis Broe. And the other thing this is a podcast called Culture and Barbarism. And this is season two. We're just beginning season two, and this is episode 5 of Culture and Barbarism. Our tagline is the politics of culture and the culture of politics. Rosa Luxemburg had once famously said that the choices are socialism or barbarism. And today it may be that what we have is culture and barbarism existing at the same time, and that's our subject. And there's a
indeed.
lot of barbarism to talk about today.
There's a heck of a lot to go around. And interestingly enough, Dennis is currently in Paris, where he lives part of the time. I'm currently in Mexico, where I live. Two stalwarts of cultural policy, our big topic of today. But we have both lived long periods in the Great Satan. Oh, sorry, the United States of America, and particularly LA and New York, where it is claimed there is no cultural policy. But Dennis, you've just written some brilliant words about recent, very significant cultural policy interventions by the Orange Comb-Over, and I wondered if you might share some of those thoughts with us.
Sure, I can, because I think our subject was going to be the Trump cuts, Trump's for lack of a better word, culture and what he's doing to it. And so I wanted to sort of extend that a little bit. So this is the piece. It's called "Meet the Government Boss, Same as the Corporate Boss." In the old days, when protests were allowed, the popular slogan on any march was "Don't mourn, organize." This slogan is useful to recall in the aftermath of Trump's defunding of public television and radio, the National Public Radio, or NPR, and television's public broadcasting system, or PBS. The effect of withdrawing 1.1 billion in public funds has meant a shutdown of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which funded the two entities. There's some horrible repercussions to this action, the worst being the defunding of local public radio and television stations, which often did serve public interest, including some Native American stations. The Republicans claim that public media was biased against them, and so, in their usual way, they simply took a sledgehammer to the problem. The larger problem, though, outside the reprehensive cutting off of lifelines to local communities, is that the biased criticism is a chimera. Programs like the PBS NewsHour and Amapour and Company do not skew left. They skew centrist Democrat, which after Biden's reworking of the party as the party of war and genocide means there's hardly a word against either war or genocide in their Washington utterances. Admittedly, there's still some good work done in documentaries, for example, on the Frontline series. On the other hand, the title of NPR's flagship series, All Things Considered, couldn't be further from the truth and should more accurately be titled All Things Considered Within the Washington Beltway and the Washington Consensus, where the range of opinion grows narrower every day. American public media was, in fact, never that. Instead, it was a public-private partnership, with PBS heavily funded by both corporations and corporate foundations, like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which, with Gates rapidly buying U.S. farmland and attempting to control the agricultural supply, might not be too critical of companies which boost big agri production. And Liberty Mutual Insurance, which was recently ordered by the state of Delaware to pay $300,000 in fines for misleading consumers. And is that part of their funding of PBS, misleading consumers? Should they be funded for that? Should they be charged for that also? The other useful distribution of public radio and television funds was to actually independent stations like those in the Pacifica network. But that funding was cut off over 10 years ago in an audit claim behind which was likely the implication that funding was not going to go to actual independent media, only to faux independent or public media. So, what is to be done? Instead of contributing to this combination of corporate and government media, why not contribute and help fund actually existent independent media in the podcast sphere? Here are 3 recent examples of the difference that illustrate how these truly independent shows without corporate or Washington funding, are not just expanding the Overton window, the limit beyond which corporate media will not go and cannot go, but shattering that window. One of the best of these is the China Report, with alternating hosts KJ No and Amanda Yee. The show's self-described purpose is every week helping you see through the propaganda with an independent view of the country we're taught to hate, but know so little about. The show is made in collaboration with a group called Pivot to Peace, a direct counter to Obama's pivot to Asia, which we now understand was a pivot to war in Asia to contain China. The latest show had Amanda Yee discussing China's role in Africa with Zambian socialist Dr. Fred Mbembe, who is currently running for president in that country. Together, they sorted through the U.S. charge that China is now constructing infrastructure in Africa, but indebting the continent, a persistent charge in U.S. media. Mbembe explained first that the charge is leveled by the European exploiters and colonizers of Africa, which China did not take part in. And secondly, following the old adage that if you point a finger, there are three fingers pointing back at you, the charge of indebting global South countries is the entire history and purpose of the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, who impose harsh conditions on debtor nations that involve cutting social services. China's lending, in order to improve infrastructure, takes place over a longer period with no requirements on how to repay the debt. Memembe also pointed out that Zambia owes a great debt to China, which helped the country which helped build the Tazara Railway in the 1970s, in which Chinese lives were lost. And the country is unlikely to forget this sacrifice, especially as it occurred at a time when China itself was still impoverished and just beginning to economically escape what it called the century of humiliation from the West. One of the most fiery podcasts and most knowledgeable about all things West Asian and Israeli is The Gray Zone. On a recent show, the host Max Blumenthal interviewed Anthony Aguilar, a decorated U.S. Special Forces operative who had enlisted in the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation because he thought the purpose was to feed starving Palestinians. He was shocked to find out that one of the actual purposes was to force those who showed up to receive food, mostly young men from starving families, to make their way past a narrow enclosed area so they could be secretly photographed by Israeli intelligence for possible future arrest or assassination, though many were shot by Israeli soldiers on the spot as they waited for aid. Aguilar's story highlighted how, once having eliminated United Nations aid by claiming its distributors were members of Hamas, the GHF was a shill operation mainly interested in securing Israeli intelligence. Finally, there was Norwegian political scientist Glenn Dysen's recent interview with economist Michael Hudson, in which the economist pointed out that not only has Trump pushed India into a more cooperative mode with China and Russia, in China, Trump is referred to as Comrade Trump and Trump the nation builder, meaning the Chinese nation. But also in the recent Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, Russia, now formally turning its back on Europe, is constructing a pipeline to pump Siberian gas to China. Dyson stressed the futility for Europe of destroying the possibility of cheap Russian oil and gas, and instead, as part of its complete resignation to the status of U.S. vassal state, buying fracked gas from the U.S. at exorbitant costs, not only to the Europeans, but also to the environment because of the extraction cost in the U.S. and the increased transport cost to ship fracked gas to Europe. All of these opinions are both beyond the mainstream corporate and public media and anticipate eventual recognition by that media years or decades from now. And that often happens. It's 3 years from now, it's now possibly okay in some corners of the corporate media to say the word genocide. But of course, in this media, it was being said almost from the opening because they were following what was going on. One other crucial issue of this new public sphere, which my host Toby has called emergent media, is the question of independence. These broadcasters count mostly on public support and are not primarily in the business for profit or because they are being paid by outside interests. That issue came up recently when an article in Wired, a magazine that focuses on new technology and media, recently revealed that a host of podcasters in the independent sphere were actually being funded by Democratic dark money, including the most well-known of these, David Pakman, who claims to have the highest ratings in the sphere. The problem is not the Democratic Party, it's not that the Democratic Party is funding these shows, but that the funding is secret, allowing them to maintain the order of independence when they, like many Republican podcasters, are partially paid by the party, or at least got startup and seed money from the party. What we're watching then is bigger money intruding into arena, which becomes more popular and holds more political sway by the moment, as witnessed the Mondami campaign in New York, where Zoran's use of social media helped earn him the mayoral nomination, while his opponent Andrew Cuomo's subsequent clumsy attempt to catch up in his videos is making him a laughingstock. It's hoped that this sphere remains free, independent, and questioning of both contemporary corporate and public media, serving as a non-subservient substitute for both.
Beautifully put, Dennis. Beautifully put. I wondered if I might add a little bit of historical perspective to NPR and PBS. And you know that history very well, so please cut in at any moment to correct me where I get it wrong or to add things, yeah? But basically, when Dennis says quite rightly that there is this massive underwriting of so-called public media in the United States by corporate interests, sometimes supposedly arm's length through foundations, but whatever. This repeats rather, what we had from the very beginning, because although there was educational television, educational radio in the US located within universities going way, way, way back, basically the mid-60s Lyndon Baines Johnson Great Society reforms in part included cultural policy initiatives of this kind and very much under the sign of the Ford Foundation.
Mm-hmm.
The Ford Foundation and other vested interests were very concerned at Black rebellions in big US cities in that summer and in previous and future summers, Detroit, DC, Los Angeles, etc. And they believed that if you could bring culture to the cities in a way that wasn't just about corporate interests, you would create a greater sense of integration in the society. So that money was there from the beginning, but so was, and this is the salvation right now of NPR and PBS, a devolved structure. So whilst it's very true, as you say, that these appalling cuts produced by the Trump people are having a huge effect, many of those institutions, especially community radio or public radio stations, are housed in community colleges or universities. They pay peppercorn rent. They have some support by those decentralized places. And also they get a lot of money from, to coin the phrase, people like you. People like us give money to support these entities. Now, having said that, I'm not for a moment defending a notion of their true autonomy from corporate and governmental pressures. You're absolutely right about that. And one of the reasons I started podcasting in 2010 was my frustration that whilst my occasional appearances on National Public Radio and my frequent listening to it showed me that very highly produced, very professional stories were being generated all the time, there was no depth. There was huge investment in production quality, production values of a seriously elevated order, but stories were not gone into with the kind of profundity that I thought was necessary. So that's why I got into this game in a very minor way compared to the people you've mentioned. I also wanted at this point, using that term you were borrowing from Obama, to pivot and to talk about cultural policy more generally in the United States, because one of the other events that we've seen in the last few weeks and the last few days is the decision to rename the Pentagon from the Department of Defense to the Department of War, which is a cultural message of a very deep nature, but two, the attacks on a Smithsonian institution and by Trump himself and by his acolytes, and the obsession with the notion that all these institutions that receive public funding from the United States federal government must bend to the will of the current administration, in this case, in the name of true history. So, Dennis, I wanted to ask you two things. First of all, if there's something you want to correct or add to what I said about PBS and NPR. But second, your take on true history, because amongst many other things, you're a distinguished historian.
Well, just to say something about the Ford Foundation, they really did have this idea of bringing culture, and that was part of the NPR, whatever. But culture also meant Cold War culture.
Mm,
That is,
mm.
you couldn't escape the boundaries of the Cold War, and the Ford Foundation was one of the most active supporters of the Cold War. So culture had to be understood within the framework of Western capitalist culture. And that's what they were going to fund. That was going to be part of it. And that was always going to be what they were. There was a woman named McCarthy from NYU, and she's done a lot of work on the Ford Foundation.
And Anna McCarthy, yeah,
Yeah, Anna McCarthy, it's very good work, actually,
yeah.
because I would say she's really got the goods on them.
Hmm.
And they're not the benevolent group they claim to be. There's a huge ideological thrust behind what they do and what they fund. So I just wanted to make that addenda. Yeah.
Oh, sure. If I could just cut in there before we go back to the Smithsonian. And of course, the Social Sciences Research Council, a name that suggests it's governmental, but in fact is the creature of the Ford Foundation, was created as part of the push to get all the social sciences in United States Research One universities dedicated to Cold War ends. And if you look at the books on civic culture, political culture, development, developing nations. They're almost all authored, edited, contributed to by straight white men from US political science and sociology and anthropology, attacking alternatives to a liberal capitalist model of development and assuming that the United States, in terms of the sloughing off, the sloughing off, depending on your pronunciation, of tribal affiliations, was a model for what should be the non-Maoist, non-Marxist development of so-called developing nations. And that model, immensely powerful, saw direct connections between the CIA, the Ford Foundation, the SSRC, and whole cohorts of political scientists, anthropologists, and sociologists. One of the books that exposes this very well is Benedict Anderson's memoir, because he was a doctoral student in politics at Cornell in East Asia during this time, East Asian studies at this time, an astonishing revelation. And of course, communication studies was far from immune to this same deal. So I think your point about the Cold War is very well made and very important.
Yes, because I think you still have the same thing today, where we have very much the same, very much in a way, two oddly similar boundaries constructed, around bricks. You can't talk about bricks. You can't talk about bricks positively. You can only talk about, Western culture and how, and Western democratic culture and how it is. And if you talk about any of the BRICS nations, you have to talk about them as a slough of dictators, you know?
Yeah.
And that's how you can talk about them, which has very little bearing to truth or truth value, and is very dangerous also, because you have a whole public that really is being indoctrinated. I just did a piece actually for Pacifica Radio, and it's called I'm sorry, it's called Manchurian Candidates. And it's about the way the US public is indoctrinated, and about the careful way that it's indoctrinated today. Anyway, yeah. So, yes. And I
On
think
the question of history and truth, Dennis, because of these debates that are circulating around the Smithsonian Institution, it's clearly on the back foot in the same way as a succession of universities have been put. We've just had the president of Northwestern resign, the president of University of Virginia go. Before that, same things at Columbia, for example, and
Harvard,
also at
it's
Harvard and at Penn. What is this all about? And what's your take, given that you came through at a time when absolute knowledge in history was being problematized?
It's true. By the way, the former head of Harvard is now one of Starmer's counselors in Britain.
Columbia. Former head of Columbia.
Yeah, former head of, sorry, of Columbia. Yes. Yeah, yeah. So I don't know, that's one of those things where I always think her actual true nature finally was revealed. Uh, there's a guy in the blacklist, and he was called the straw boss of the blacklist, and he was the head of Yahtzee, the head of the union, but named Brewer. But when the communist threat dissipated, he immediately went to work for United Artists as an executive. And I thought, well, that's the work he was doing all along. It's
All
finally
along.
acknowledged, it's a similar thing. Anyway, all right. So um, well, yeah, it was a time when history was being questioned. And I mean, my thought around that time was that less problematizing of history and more historical, more deeper and more and deeper historical research is what's needed,
Better
actually.
history.
Yeah, better, not questioning of
Mm.
whether it's possible. I never thought that was a great idea. Of course, all history is biased. What can you do? You wade into it and you start doing it, and you acknowledge your biases and
Mm.
you produce your work, and then someone will come along and correct it or whatever. But that's the way to do history, not to question, that I always thought it was very dangerous to question whether history was possible. Of course, it's both not possible and possible, you know, uh, but it's better to do it than not to do it. What we have today is really is an incredible dearth of historical memory and imagination. I've got to say this thing. I've been watching Chinese television, so I'm going to write a couple of things about it. But one of the things is a series called The Long Road Back. And it's about a unit in Northeast China that gets a small independent, kind of pro communist but anti Japanese unit that gets separated. Everyone gets separated, and they're all trying to come back and meet at this place. Um, anyway, so for that, I've been sort of reading about this cultural thing in China. And the New York Times, when it wrote this thing, the figure, it's all told, military and civilian casualties by the Chinese is 35 million. 35 million were killed in China by the Japanese. The New York Times wrote, when they were writing the article, they wrote in parentheses, well, there was some opposition, but this was not mainly led by the communists. It was mainly led by by Chiang Kai-shek, which is the most incredible, that they think they could actually get away with this, is really a sense of the lack of historical imagination and the lack of historical understanding, which is very dangerous.
I think part of the complaint
But
that
I'll just say that part of the impetus for the revolution was the fact that people understood that Chiang Kai-shek really had to be bribed to try to take on the Chinese. He really wasn't into it. Yeah, I mean, to take on the Japanese, he wasn't really that into it. He was more into, maintaining his fiefdom. And the part of the impetus for the Chinese Revolution was these were the people, as everywhere else, as in Europe, these were the people who actually fought the fascists. So
oh,
that,
absolutely.
that this demonstration, and it was pointed out too that the countries who were there, uh, both North and South Korea, both represented, Indonesia, a lot, these countries were countries that were also victims of the Chinese aggression. It's also been pointed out that, because the article in the New York Times, a really interesting article, is that this is all about hating the Japanese, and that's all that it is about. Okay, there is one thing though. There's one thing, which is that, the Japanese never apologized. The Germans did. They have memorials everywhere for what they did. The Japanese have never, and their historical sense is completely skewed.
If I could just
They have
clarify one
generation.
thing. So the
Yeah.
Chinese didn't occupy Korea and Indonesia, it was the Japanese.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I mean,
And Japan occupied China from 37 to 45. So
well,
it was
actually 31 is when Manchuria starts.
Right, but
They
the
invade.
total control, or almost
Yeah,
total control,
yeah,
is 37, and this includes not only the slaughter of people in immense numbers that you mentioned, but also the appalling so-called rape of Nanjing,
yeah,
which, to its
yeah.
credit, the League of Nations documented extensively and has become a very important element in histories of sexual violence by men against women and their connection to power rather than to sexuality. Yeah, no, I mean,
And
great.
unless I'm wrong, never really acknowledged by the Japanese. That's also the point of contention between the
Yeah.
Japanese and the Koreans. You know, that they were used, that the Korean women were used to service the Japanese servicemen, partly in China. They were exported to China. And this has never been talked about, you know.
And this is the whole school textbook controversy going back over decades about what Japanese children learn about the Second World War. I should say that as someone who got a lot of his schooling in Britain, the history I learned was of the glory of the British Empire
Mm, mm.
and, the struggle against slavery, not Britain's role in slavery.
No, this is very interesting, right? Yeah. I mean, I always laugh at, and my students, one of them got very agitated because at the end of what Steven Spiel Amistad,
Mm.
remember the end of Amistad? It's all about how it shows the British blowing up a slave fort, where you could easily have had them, kidnapping and bringing people across because they were the ones who transported, but instead it gets whitewashed in this, kind of Steven Spielberg version. The
Version.
British become the heroes for having eliminated slavery when in fact the empire was built on
Oh,
slavery.
not just the empire, but the British economy
Yeah.
in its modern iteration. Getting back, if I could, to the Smithsonian, one of
Yeah.
the issues here, it seems to me, is that there is controversy over these really big ticket events like the war. But there is also controversy about social history, about what used to be called people hidden from history, about the folks who, in the unfurling of grand narratives about a country, are normally excluded. Indigenous people, women, sexual minorities, and so on. And in the context of the Americas, slaves. And the inclusion of these people as part of that story and their struggles, both across that history and to be included historiographically, are, I think, key stimuli for the Bush people because of this desire
Trump, you
to.
mean, right?
Oh, sorry, I said Bush. Yeah, I need to correct you on China and Japan. You need to correct me on presidential nomenclature.
Well, Bush is not that far off either. So there you
No,
go.
and interestingly, this is the other thing I wanted to get to, that the Republican Party, although it accepted the formation of things like the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Endowment for the Arts again in 65, very quickly adopted negative attitudes to these things. Now, why? The NEA and the NEH are toothless. They're nothing compared to, say, the National Science Foundation. They're important symbolically, especially the NEA, because of the connection, again designed by Ford, for there to be articulations between state-based cultural and arts agencies and the feds. But why have they been such targets for the Republicans, given that they don't cost very much? It's to do historically with the idea that we can show to our base that we'll get rid of things that are about different forms of sexuality from the Republican norm and the Democrat norm, different forms of art practice, and different forms of attitude towards the nation and the government. And without this actually having much of an effect. So for decades, the Republicans have threatened to destroy the legislative base to the NEA and the NEH, but they've never actually gone ahead with it. It's always been pulled back because there are so many people with so many interests in the states that say to their senators, for God's sake, don't do this. What we have now for the first time is a cultural block, a cultural formation of evangelical Christianity, right wing politics, cult of personality, and a lack of Republican individualism, ironically, in the Senate. No backbone to stand up to almost anything. So we have for the first time the perfect storm, the formula for defunding art and culture in these ways.
I have to say also a lack of democratic standing up also. I mean, we watched in Washington where Trump Trump puts, you see the scary pictures of the National Guard in front of the Capitol building in Washington. And the Democrats at first were up in arms. They said, of course, we can really do well with this. And then Trump said, wait a minute, what I'm doing is addressing crime. You sure you want to question me? Because I'm about, making the streets safe. And the Democrats backed off.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the streets might be safer, but nothing is safer inside closed doors when Donald Trump is involved. Um, I wanted to get back to where I began, if we could, Dennis, and to cast a distinction. And here we're going to go on to the terrain of film, if that's okay with you.
But
Between, on the one hand, where we currently are, France and Mexico, which, as I said, have avowed important cultural policies. In the case of France, it's really standing up to Hollywood, but also la gloire in terms of an idea of the state and its role. And you get obviously a thriving French film industry, in part in riposte to Hollywood, although often feeding into it. Here in Mexico, the thriving bit of cultural policy is originally animated by a desire for nation building under the sign of respect for indigeneity, for First Peoples. Now, in fact, that respect, exists in anthropological museums. It doesn't exist in everyday life. But they're those things. In the United States, it is claimed, getting onto the film topic again, that Hollywood exists as a purely private enterprise. That the reason it's successful around the world is that, unlike Italian cinema or German cinema or Mexican cinema, it appeals to everyday people regardless of language or cultural background. And this is because of the unique relationship to the audience that is driven by capitalism, by private enterprise, by laissez-faire. Forever, this is a lie. Almost every state in the US has film commissions that offer vast sums to attract Hollywood. The two biggest
And
ones,
California just tripled their sum.
right? And this is because of New Mexico and Georgia. This is Georgia in the US, and historically Louisiana, but also New York. And it's because there are sucker countries around the world like Britain and Australia and Spain that offer
Hungary.
huge incentives for Hollywood to come and film there. The Spanish actually have a name for this. So when they bought Game of Thrones from the Swedes, in other words, they offered more incentives to Hollywood than the Swedes did. They call them service, which isn't a term used in Latin America, but it means service film and television, i.e., not your own stories. Now, there can be good aspects to this. For example, in Colombia, which also offers massive incentives, the people in Colombia who work on these TV series and these films get better technology, better pay, and better working conditions, and more satisfaction, they say, than when they work on narconovelas, the glorification of the narcos that is their bread and butter in terms of making broadcast television within the Colombian context. So I'm not suggesting there are no benefits to this, but I am suggesting that one needs to be very critical with the idea that there's no cultural policy in the US or elsewhere that assists Hollywood's hegemony. And also, we need to bear in mind that all the studies show that economically there is no value to Georgia or Louisiana or New Mexico or New York in these incentives to film. So I just wanted to get that sort of on the record and get your thoughts on cultural policy and film with reference, say, to France by contrast with Hollywood.
Okay, I want to go back to the point you made about the historical block that's now being constructed. Where is the and who it's letting out? So where is the opposition to this historical bloc? Because there doesn't seem to be very much opposition within the US. And I want to make the claim that the the opposition has never been greater, but it's not within the US and largely not within the West. I mean, Mexico has just signed a trade agreement with Brazil. You know, they're making other plans. Who isn't after what Trump has done? There's so much resistance and so many of these countries that are being called dictatorships actually have probably more respect and are probably more multicultural countries than anyone realizes. I'm talking about China and Russia, of all things.
Mm.
Americans don't know this, but there's a great deal of respect in China at the moment, for these various cultures that make up the Chinese, the Chinese country. Same thing in Russia. They have, from the revolution, this idea from in Russia that, yes, there's a revolutionary policy, but that policy includes much respect for local cultures, including local languages. That's part of the affront at Ukraine, making it illegal to speak Russian in Ukraine. So I think that we're not seeing it, but I think that where a lot of this is, where the resistance is coming from, and it's more every day now. India has joined, which is, you know, one could never have thought that Trump would possibly have driven India into the Russian Chinese orbit. And yet he has, by the one thing that, well, the two things that he could do to do this. One is that, of course, everyone knows, and everyone in Europe knows, that Russia's been selling oil to India, which has been refining it and selling it on to Russia, less expensive than US oil. And Trump said, you can't do that. We're going to tax that. We're going to put a tariff on that. And the Indians said, no, you aren't. We're not going to let you do that.
Yeah.
And the other one is Trump wanting to put tariffs uh, on Indian food in the Indian Agricultural Center. And Modi knows that, one, you do not, I'm going to, with my language, you do not fuck with the farmers in India. It is really dangerous to do that. And they are a very active political group, and they're quite capable of bringing Modi down if they decide. So he's not going to go along with this. So, but I do think that where this hegemony, which, as you said, is a very strong right now historical block in the U.S., is being challenged. It's being challenged everywhere outside of the U.S. You know, to go to the film thing, I wanted to make one point about the thing about, because this happens in Europe too, and it's a big thing, which is that, yes, all the things that you said, all the benefits come in. The technology is greater, the pay is greater. Your stuff can now, if it gets on Netflix, and Spain is, the cultural country that Netflix is, got the strongest imprint in, and you have now a world market that you didn't have access to before. The problem is, the problem is, one of the things that you go there is because there are technicians who are already trained. So you're not actually retraining them. You're giving them slightly larger platform. But the other thing too is that the goal and the project here is to keep them in subservience. In other words, to keep them enlisted in Netflix. They're not interested in having another platform that will challenge Netflix, or in having Spanish production that's for itself. It has to be within that banner. And I just did an article on a series called Marked in South Africa. So that television series was is it's pretty good. It's kind of a truth-telling series. It's in the heist mode. It's in the modern female heist mode,
Hmm.
like Set It Off and Widows. Okay. But in the end, it kind of turns on itself. But the question was, it really has a lot of politics in it, and it's got some really good sentiments. There's a point where the gangster is talking to this woman who can't her daughter's she works for this, she drives armored car trucks for this company, and she doesn't have enough money, which is 1.1 million, to to save her daughter who's going to die of cancer. So she decides to pull off a heist. Okay. She goes to this mobster, this local mobster, and he's looking out. This is Johannesburg. He's looking out on Soweto, and he says, I said, we eat cabbage. They, on the other side of Soweto, eat caviar. So there are good politics in this. In the end, so I said, why? Well, one of the reasons why is that there is a rival streaming service in Africa that has more people subscribe to it than Netflix. Netflix is weakest in Africa. So Netflix has to pay attention to what that service is doing.
Mm.
And if that service is creating more sort of local stories that are more truth telling, then Netflix has to
Mhm.
respond to that. So I think that's part of what creates the tension in this series. But anyway, so I think these things are different, in different parts of the world. But remember what we did to Viaplay. Viaplay got very popular and everyone loved Scandi Noir. It was the hottest thing. And everybody thought, wow. And Viaplay said, well, look, we're so popular. Why don't we try to make it on our own in the US and British markets? Well, didn't make it, and they're back now, and they're sort of a shell of their former self, because they weren't allowed, really. They were not going to allow Viaplay, a Scandinavian company, to really penetrate their market.
Their markets.
So, you know,
I
so
got
you
a,
so you're right. Yes, you're right. They do get a lot. Well, that's not even to mention, you mentioned the new Department of War, which of course has always been the Department of War. I mean, that's what it was originally, and now they've finally gone back to truth telling, because that's what it is. It's not the Department of Defense. The U.S. doesn't do defense. The U.S. does aggressive war. Anyway, um, so yes, the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, the Department of War funds a lot of projects in a lot of movie projects in a lot of different ways. And many people have written about this in very good ways, including you, I believe, actually, in terms of talking about, games and that kind of thing. So that's another way that Hollywood is not independent.
yeah, we should mention here if you've ever watched an action adventure film from the United States that's got a big budget, chances are there's an aircraft carrier or
That's
a
right.
Navy warship or some fighting aircraft. And Hollywood pays nothing
Yes.
for the use of those. It pays nothing for tens of thousands of serving military people as extras. All what it has to do is the quid pro quo for this extraordinary subvention worth hundreds of millions every year is to show what the script says. And there are
That's right.
times
Yeah.
when
That's
the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force and the Pentagon, all four have their script sovereign readers, right? Small groups.
They're the new Hayes Commission from
They
Hollywood
are.
in the 1930s. It's now
That's
ruled
right.
by the Department of War.
Yes, quite.
The
They say
Breen,
we don't like this.
Joseph Breen is now Pete Hegseth.
Oh God. Well, at least the hairdo is appropriate for that period, all that Brill cream. But
Yeah,
the the thing here is that these institutions have the right of veto effectively if
yeah,
they don't like the way they're represented. So if you look at the two Top Gun movies, they're classics of this, but there are plenty of others as well.
yes. And there are a few examples too of films that didn't toe the line that got refused.
Mhm.
And what happens then? You got a much smaller budget, or your film doesn't get made.
Yeah.
So
And
that ought to teach you a lesson.
yeah,
Yeah,
no aircraft carrier for you, buddy.
yeah,
So
yeah,
these things are hidden subventions, but very real. The other element, of course, is that when in the United States, for example, film commissions say, we've brought in all this money to the state, isn't it incredible? But really, the actors, the producers, the directors, they live in LA and New York. They don't live in Illinois. Sorry. And where do they actually pay whatever taxes they pay? It's back there. Where do they
yeah.
actually spend money as consumers? Back home. They're paying for nothing. Hotel rooms, forget about it, in these other states and other cities where they're filming. Same with Canada. Vast amounts of money make Montreal stand in for Chicago, for example. Lots of other faux settings.
Vancouver for Jersey in
Vancouver,
you know,
Jersey.
what do you call it? In what was that series? You know, the Mafia series from HBO in the
The
90s.
Sopranos.
The Sopranos, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Uh,
And the X-Files.
and the X-Files, lots of them, lots of
Yeah.
them. It's always worth, if you can be bothered, staying on till the end of the credits of movies
That's
and
right. Oh, I always do.
TV series to see who actually paid for this. Where was this actually shot? Sometimes you can work out early by looking at the last names of the people who are in the credits.
Yes.
And if they're not as mixed as the last names in the United States are, you've got part of your answer. It's probably Australia, Canada, Britain, if they're one kind of last name. Or
And just like anything else, a lot of the when you see the technical credits at the end of, say, like the Fantastic Four or Superman, a lot of the stuff is shipped out to Asian countries
oh,
where the
big time.
technical stuff is done,
Well,
much cheaper, you
and
know.
often what happens is it's then shipped back to Santa Monica where they fix it.
Yeah.
The original creativity, the hard yards, are made by folks in Vietnam and the Philippines and so on. The Simpsons, ironically, both thematizes this and does it.
Yes, they're very good. They're very good at both of those things. Yeah. Yeah. I
But
remember that there was a it was, I think, in the first Trump administration, there was a studio that was set up in Michigan. I can't remember which company. It might have been Disney, with promises of unlimited jobs forever. Turned out that pretty much they folded after about 6 months, and that was the end of the jobs. But they got a lot of very substantial, tax credits claiming this. But it's not permanent. What they promise is not permanent.
no,
Um,
I didn't know about that, but I'm not surprised. And these things often involve massive public investment with really minimal public return. And I
yeah.
guess that's the point I want to get at. There is the kind of cultural policy that is very overt, and there's the kind of cultural policy that's very covert. And a further bifurcation, there are really two key bifurcations for me, is between the idea of sustaining difference and heritage and storytelling versus the idea of stimulating industry.
Mhm.
And very frequently, these two goals, stimulating industry versus stimulating culture for its own sake, see much more money going to the industry side, and that money being part of the covert rather than the overt system.
Could you explain a little more what you mean by that? I'm not
Well,
really
that
clear.
the money that pump primes cultural industries is often dedicated to the idea that these will become freestanding laissez-faire industries.
Mhm.
Now, the fact that there are no such things in the world doesn't matter. That's the logic. We can build a new Hollywood here, right? Then there's the other kind of cultural policy that says we're not here for commercial reasons. We're not here to create a standalone industry. We're here to deal with really important aspects of people's heritage and ways of living, ways of being, and storytelling that can't be sold, but that need public support to be maintained, to be sustained. Yeah, that's a sort of crucial difference, right? Now, the problem is that whilst on the commercial side, sometimes this is overt, as in, we'll build a new Hollywood here in Brisbane or on the Gold Coast in Australia. A lot of the time, per what we were saying about the last names and the locations at the end of the credits, these things are actually subcutanean, they're subterranean, they're hidden. So, to give you an example, during the writers' strike in 1988 in Hollywood, 150-day strike, lots of the TV series were shot elsewhere with scripts written elsewhere, but based on Hollywood originals. So a classic was the recasting of Mission Impossible. I'm not talking here about the movie series with Tom Cruise, but the revived Mission Impossible TV show from the late 60s to early 70s that was shot in Australia in the late 80s for 2 seasons. Australian taxpayers were told, watch the Gold Coast tonight, and you'll see a great advertisement worldwide for tourists to come to Australia. But if you were watching that in New York or Champaign, Illinois, you had no idea that this was Australia. It wasn't sold as such. It wasn't meant to look like that. It was meant to be wherever the Mission Impossible producers wanted that location to appear as. So that's my problem with A, the commercial slant that is so often covert in its subvention, but B, the radical separation from the more overt, honest, and in many ways valuable aspects to cultural policy, which is the overt type. Now, the problem with what the Trump people are doing is that they're attacking the overt type, the Smithsonian. Here we are wanting to tell you the full panoply of American history, for example, but they're not doing anything really. They said they would, but they're not, about the covert type, which is the subvention of commercial industries, because they like that and they want that.
Right.
Does that make more sense, Dennis?
Yeah, it makes sense. One thing I want to say is that this is that sort of global local thing,
Mm-hmm.
and in Europe, you know, when you go to, I've been going to these television, conventions, festivals for years. There's one here called Series Mania, right? It's the biggest in the world. And when the producers come from the streaming services, all they talk about in terms of penetrating Europe is how we're only interested in local stories because we realize that local stories are what sell. And if that happens to go global, well, so much the better. But we're interested in local stories. Now, partly that's true because they're trying to penetrate the market. So they have to be interested in local story,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So they are, but partly the way they construct the local stories is always with an idea and and an eye on the global.
Mm-hmm.
So there's really a thing between, well, it can't be too local. What are you kidding me? Kind of. I saw a really good series that's set in Galicia. I think it was a Netflix series, actually. It was pretty good, but it didn't travel outside of Galicia really, but it was a good series about Galicia. You
Mm-hmm.
know? Some of these Chinese series that I'm watching another one now called Beneath the Undertow. It's a detective series, and it is really concerned with Chinese problems. It has the last episode, well, they're long, they're 19 episodes in this murder mystery, but they go lots of different places. And the last episode I watched, which is episode 11 of Beneath the Undertow, was about essentially cam girls and what cam girls are like in China and how they're seen in the society. And it's a big criticism of them that the woman who's doing it is very unhappy. And she says, my parents sold vegetables. In other words, my parents sold vegetables. I'm given $10,000 by somebody and I have this luxurious apartment and I don't do anything but take some of my clothes off. What kind of a world are we living in? So
Oh,
it's really sort of a different way. It's a Chinese way of looking at some of these things. That's truly local, you know.
yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think that it's, I think that we need to see more of that, you know.
Uh-huh. I
I,
couldn't
I
agree
mean,
more.
France is a good example because you take the French series and they are, a lot of them, unfortunately, are too much, sort of overworked American series in the French context, rather than French series. I mean, there was a really great one. It was about World War II. Now the name is eluding me. It's a really extraordinary series. It's their best series ever, but it didn't travel very well outside of France, and
Uh-huh.
so much the better for it, because it was a really good look at France during World War II. And that series got really little play. So uh, if it's truly local, it doesn't. it doesn't usually. Un Village Français, that's the name of the series.
Aha, aha.
The greatest French series ever, actually, you know. But did it travel? No. So does anyone know it? No. Did it get picked up? Did it spark other series? No. They went on to, Call My Agent, which for me is just really sort of poor, like The Office or that kind of, which Hollywood does it better in my view. But, anyway, there's always that. There's that global local thing, that you're talking about. Could I bring up another topic, maybe as an introduction to our next podcast?
Mm.
And since we are talking about culture, I wanted to just speak a little bit about universities and the defunding of universities, just a bit. You know, there's several aspects of this, which maybe just will sort of outline another one. The foolishness of Comrade Trump, both defunding STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, as China pours more and more money into this, and also the new restrictions on Chinese students entering the US and going after Chinese researchers claiming they're spies, that is, they used to say driving while black, researching while Chinese, is this strange thing, and there's two things. I mean, science should not be locked up. It's part of a common good. Second, it's Chinese grad students who are doing the grunt work in US labs, and they're going to cut this out. I mean, cutting off your nose to save your face while actually losing face. And the other thing, though, is that, part of the defunding, okay, so part of it is going on around, first tier universities and elite campuses. But a big part of the defunding is going on around community colleges and state universities, the former where working class kids often start their education, and the latter where they may finish because in state the costs are cheaper. So this goes along with a general de-skilling of the working class, which is part of the purpose of things like AI, so that they're only available for remedial work and can't rise above that. So I think it would be good to maybe next time to take a look at, the Republican quote education policy such as it is.
I couldn't agree more. And I think it actually merges well with our principal topics today, which ended up being cultural and media policy. So, Dennis, thanks a lot. And folks, will be back here in season two with, I guess it'll
Yes,
be episode 6 on
episode
education.
6. That's right. Okay, good. We'll see everyone in a little bit. And you can find our podcast, Toby's on, tell them where, Toby, for yours.
So via Podbean, and it's called Podbean, PODBEAN.com, Cultural Studies, one word, Cultural Studies, one word. You can also find it on Apple and all those other usual
Right.
places.
Right. And you can find, and I put it up on Apple and those places too. And you can also find it with the video version with a number of inserts and some music intro in and out on my Substack, which is called Cultural Politics for Those Who Care.
Indeed, wonderful site. So many thanks to you, Dennis, and many thanks to our listeners and viewers.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody.